Welcome and thank you for joining today's former worker medical screening webinar on asbestos. My name is Nickie Warren. I'm part of the staff with the Pantex former worker program and will be moderating the webinar today. Before we start, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. The webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the DOE former worker program website, where you can locate the postings of all our previous webinars. In the upcoming weeks, you'll receive an email with a link to the recording. During the webinar, all attendees are automatically muted and the video function is disabled. At any time, you can type questions in the Q&A section that is located on the lower right portion of your screen. We did receive a number of questions during the registration, and we'll do our best to address them through the presentation itself and at the end of the presentation. I will now turn the mic over to Dr. Cynthia Ball, who currently serves as co-PI at the University of Texas Health Science Center at Tyler.
Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us today. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Arthur Frank. He is an emeritus professor of public health from Drexel University after a career as an academic physician. He is a fellow of the Collegium Ramazzini, an independent scientific academy named after the father of occupational medicine. He first studied asbestos and asbestos-related diseases as a medical student while at Mount Sinai in New York, and continues to do so. He has done such work around the world in China, Mongolia, India, Sri Lanka, Brazil, Colombia, and elsewhere, and has published dozens of peer-reviewed papers about that subject. He has been a faculty member at Mount Sinai, University of Kentucky, and University of Texas at Tyler. He was the original PI for the Pantex former worker program, which is where I met him, and continued with the program as a consultant until this year. His willingness to provide educational programming is a testament to his ongoing commitment to this program and to the workers served by it. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Frank.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ball, for that very nice introduction. And Dr. Ball and Nickie were dear colleagues through the Pantex program that I was involved with for many years. What I'd like to do with you this afternoon is take you on a trip and basically look at this question of what's the big deal about asbestos? And we're going to go from the laboratory to the bedside to the population and maybe beyond. And so as we go through, I'll try and answer some of the questions that have already come in. And if not, if we have some time at the end, I'll answer some of the questions that had not yet been answered. So for those that need a quick refresher or don't know too much about asbestos, it is a naturally occurring mineral. It occurs in nature. It's not manufactured or made. The term is an old Greek term meaning unquenchable. Lamps that both the Greeks and the Romans used had asbestos wicks so that as long as you kept them filled with oil, they would burn essentially forever because the wicks wouldn't burn up like modern candles do. Asbestos really refers to two families of 6 fibers. The serpentine form, which is also called chrysotile, or the white asbestos, makes up about 90 to 95% of all the asbestos that's ever been used, both here in the United States and worldwide. There are 5 amphiboles, only 2 of which have been commercially important, and that is the brown or amosite asbestos and the blue or chrysotile asbestos. The other 3 types are occasionally run into mostly as contaminants and are not particularly used as products, though occasionally anthophyllite, which was primarily only mined in Finland, was used in some few products. I have here a slide, and sort of in the middle to the right, there's a streak that goes from lower left to upper right, and that's an asbestos body. It comes from an autopsy done in the year 1899. In that year, Dr. Montague Murray in Great Britain had as a patient a gentleman in his mid-30s who told Dr. Montague Murray that he was one of 10 young men that had started working in the East End of London at an asbestos uh, textile factory. And he also shared that he was the 10th and last alive, and that all of his mates, his 9 predecessors, had died of respiratory problems. And he too was dying of respiratory problems. And when Dr. Montague Murray did the autopsy, he called these things that he saw curious bodies. He didn't quite know what they were. They didn't actually get the name asbestos bodies for about another 20 years. So clearly, in the late 1890s, and there was a government factory report from 1898 from Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Factories. And so the question that is sometimes asked is, we've known about asbestos for such a long time, and yet why are we only addressing it now? I think the answer is pretty straightforward and simple. Is a lot of companies that were very powerful and very rich, made a lot of money, were able to influence politics and regulation. It's what we saw 100 years ago, and it's what to some extent we still see now. So asbestos is still widely used in the world. It's not nearly as much used as before, but there's still about 1 million tons a year being processed. Most of it comes from Russia. Other major countries that mine asbestos are Kazakhstan, China. There are a few other minor places. And the global consumption, this slide's a bit old, it's 2012, and you see that China and India were about the same. At this point, China has tried to stop using asbestos. India, on the other hand, has continued to use it. So the number one user of that 1 million tons right now is the country of India. 98% of that goes into asbestos cement and a couple of percent in other products such as brakes and so forth. Most asbestos in the world is still used in Asia, Southeast Asia, a little bit of it in Africa, and we'll talk a bit about where asbestos is no longer used, but still occasionally sneaks in. The World Health Organization estimates on a yearly basis about 250,000 asbestos-related deaths. There's about 40,000 estimated each year in the United States as individuals dying from an asbestos-related disease. So it is still a significant problem. And why it's still a problem with less use is something we'll be talking about. About 70 countries in the world have totally banned the use of asbestos. However, the United States is not one of these countries. We have a partial ban. In reality, we haven't been importing any amphiboles for some time, but we still import some chrysotile, and as a legal product for some products, chrysotile is still allowed, and products containing asbestos are still being brought into the country. Some we know about, like roofing shingles or automotive brakes from some countries. On the other hand, there are other products that are brought into the country here, but even countries that have banned it, such as children's toys. The new fad seems to be some cloth doll-like structures that are filled with sand, and that sand has been shown to contain asbestos, and other play sands have asbestos as well, and they still make it into some of these countries where bans have taken place. In some countries, even though there's a ban on the books, such as work that I've done in Mongolia, they surreptitiously bring in the asbestos in bags marked sugar and still bring it into the country for use. And some countries that have bans have been browbeaten. Russia, which is the major producer, for example, told Sri Lanka, if you don't continue to use our asbestos, we won't buy your tea. So if somebody wonders why and if there are powerful forces out there, yes, there are. A very simple question. does stopping the use of asbestos stop disease? And the answer, quite resoundingly, of course, is yes. We know this because the first country to ban asbestos, interestingly, was Iceland, followed by Sweden. This was over 30 years ago, followed fairly quickly over the years by all of the European Union countries. Any new country that wants to join the European Union has to ban asbestos and can't use it. And if we look at the rate of asbestos disease from those countries that have banned it, they are going down and going down significantly. Even here in the United States, where the peak use was in 1973, with about 800,000 tons of asbestos being used, we're now down to about 2,000 tons a year. We have seen very few new cases of asbestosis, the scarring of the lung, but we still have, and the numbers, in fact, are increasing, cases of cancers related to the use of asbestos. What we also know is that some countries have very poor data collection, so we don't even know what the actual risk of disease is. The Russians, who don't want to be seen as producing a deadly material, literally stopped counting their mesothelioma cases a few years ago, and they will tell you, we have no mesotheliomas, but that's because they don't count them. I've done extensive work in India for many years. I've been going there for more than 2 decades. And the government there inexplicably did not record mesothelioma cases up until very, very recently. And some research that I did with a colleague there showed that in only about 1/5 of the hospitals over a 10-year period, and not all of them even reported, there were over 2,200 cases of mesothelioma and asbestos-related cancer. And so the fact that the government had not recorded a single case doesn't mean that it wasn't there. And that's why this old public health phrase, the absence of data does not mean the absence of disease, holds very true. Now, there still are some legitimate scientific questions regarding asbestos. Is there a different toxicity between the different fibers? Some people claim that one or another fiber causes more cancer. Some have shown, some of my work, I also happen to have a PhD related to cell culture and organ culture work related to asbestos, that fibers that some say are not the most carcinogenic, on the other hand, are the most toxic to certain cell lines. Another issue is fiber size. There's something called the fiber size hypothesis, and there's some evidence that fibers of a particular size are the most carcinogenic, but that doesn't mean that either smaller or larger fibers do not cause cancer. And then there's a couple of papers that say if you mix the fiber types, if somebody works at a work site where both amphiboles and chrysotile exposure takes place, that there is fiber synergy, that just as we'll talk later about some synergistic or multiplicative effects of multiple exposures, that the two fiber types together may in fact cause more cancer to occur than if one is exposed to only one or another fiber type. On the other hand, there are many so-called contrived controversies. A lot of countries, especially because it's the most commonly used one, say that chrysotile is the safe asbestos. There is nothing farther from the truth. In countries like Russia, where they mine chrysotile, in Canada, which before Russia was the largest chrysotile producer in the world, there was plenty of disease, and by no means is chrysotile safe. There's also the issue of so-called biopersistence. Amphiboles stay in the lung longer. The chrysotile fibers leave the lung more quickly. So people have said, well, chrysotile doesn't cause disease because it leaves the lung. Well, what they don't tell you is, yes, it does leave the lung. Some of it gets dissolved, but it also migrates much more easily to the pleura, the lining of the lung tissue on the outer edge of the lung, which is where 90% of mesotheliomas occur. So the fact that it doesn't last in the lung is meaningless. The other issue is that of so-called controlled use. Well, in our country, they say we use it in a controlled manner. Again, nothing could be farther from the truth. In a scientific study in Canada, which had very strict controls on the use of asbestos. One study looked at 10 work sites and found that only 1 out of 10 met the regulations, even in a country with a lot of experience and very strict regulations. So simply put, in countries like India, Mongolia, Sri Lanka, South America, there's no such thing as controlled use. The other really bizarre issue that comes up is in India, the companies there say, well, Indians are genetically different from Europeans and Westerners, so we don't get asbestos mesotheliomas. Our genes protect us. They don't bother to tell you that we share 99.999% of our genes, and clearly the fact that they hadn't recorded any doesn't mean that the disease didn't exist in India, where it certainly does. The same Dr. Montague Murray, having done this autopsy, by 1906, more than 100 and, well, it's now 120 years, wrote, "One hears, generally speaking, that considerable trouble is now taken to prevent the inhalation of dust, so the disease is not so likely to occur as heretofore." Now, he didn't know about cancers then. He was just talking about asbestosis. And he said, look, we know that there's a problem. If we prevent the inhalation of dust, basic prevention, people won't get disease. Unfortunately, he didn't get it right. And as we sit here in 2026, 120 years later, we know this. We know that there's a whole range of non-malignant diseases, so-called asbestos warts. It gets into the skin. It's pretty rare, but it does cause a wart-like growth. Benign asbestotic pleural effusion. Benign because it's not a cancer, but there's fluid that builds up in the lung. It scares the heck out of the clinician because it's bloody and you feel pretty sure there's a cancer in there, but you can't find one. They tend to clear up pretty spontaneously, and it's the first major sign, usually within the first 10 years of exposure. But what we really are concerned about is asbestosis, which is scar tissue caused by asbestos, either in the lung parenchyma itself, the meat of the lung, or the lining of the lung called the pleura. And one of the questions put to us is, what are the first symptoms of exposure to asbestos? Well, it depends on what disease, but if it's asbestosis, the first symptom is usually shortness of breath. What happens is, as the tissue becomes scarred, it's harder for the oxygen to transfer from the lungs into the bloodstream and feed the body. So shortness of breath is what's noted. Another question was, does asbestos cause COPD? Well, COPD is really two diseases. It's chronic bronchitis and emphysema, neither of which are caused by asbestos. The earliest and minor changes that you see with asbestos exposure is some obstructive changes, and COPD is obstructive lung disease, but that's usually not all that clinically important. What does occur over time as the lungs become more scarred is restrictive changes, where the lungs become stiff and don't move as well, don't take as much oxygen in, the diffusing capacity goes down. And so asbestos is really thought primarily to cause restrictive lung disease rather than obstructive lung disease, even though some of the earliest changes are some mild obstructive changes. What really concerns us about asbestos is the fact that it causes a whole range of cancers. Lung cancer, mesothelioma, which can occur 90% of the time in the pleura, that's in the lining of the chest, in the peritoneum, the lining tissue of the abdomen, the lining tissue around the heart, that's pericardial mesotheliomas, and they're about peritoneals are about 10%, pericardials about 1%, and about 1% also testicular mesotheliomas, the lining tissues in males. But it also causes gastrointestinal tract cancers, that of the esophagus, stomach, and colorectal cancers, laryngeal cancers, various oropharyngeal cancers like tonsillar cancer, renal cancers, so it gets into the kidney, and in women, of course, ovarian cancer as well. So these are all cancers that have been related to exposure to asbestos. Now, somebody can identify asbestos by looking at the fibers under the microscope. Here is polarized light microscopy, and this is what asbestos might look like. This is scanning electron microscopy in a chrysotile fiber with individual fibrils. Think of it more like a piece of rope that's made up of many pieces. It sort of unwinds here, and this would be what chrysotile looks like. This is, again, chrysotile under transmission electron microscope study with very high magnification. And you can use X-ray diffraction or electron diffraction to identify single fibers and identify what type of fiber it is. So these are capable of being identified in tissue or in specimens. Now here's a better looking asbestos body. An asbestos body is a fiber of asbestos that is coated with an iron and protein matrix that covers the fiber. For every one of these, there are probably hundreds, if not thousands, of uncoated fibers, usually much smaller. And I will say that all of you listening into the webinar today, every one of us has some of these in our lung. Asbestos is a pretty ubiquitous material. It's found all over the world in the air. You can measure it in the polar ice caps. If you go dig down, hundreds of years ago, you'd find a few fibers because it's a naturally occurring material. By the time it was widely used in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and onward, you could find more of it in the ice caps because there was more in the air that even ended up in the Arctic. Now, does that mean that because we all have asbestos in our lungs, we're all going to get disease? Absolutely not. We all have asbestos, but again, relatively few people end up with an asbestos disease. And it all goes back to a very simple understanding, which goes back 500 years, the expression from Paracelsus that the dose makes the poison. So a small amount of asbestos is unlikely, not impossible, but unlikely to cause disease. It's not going to cause asbestosis, which we don't know exactly how much it takes, but takes passing a certain threshold. But there's no known safe level of asbestos. And so even as little as 1 day of exposure, we'll show you the data, can give rise to cancers. But not everybody that's exposed, even industrial workers that have a lot of exposure, not everyone gets a disease. Even insulators, while 94% of them end up with asbestosis and many of them end up with cancers, there's still a few of them that will not. And that's a lot more exposure than people in the general population get. This is what the inside of a lung would look like. It should be thinner and lacy. You see these clumps of tissue, especially in the middle. It makes it hard for the oxygen to transfer from the air sacs into the blood vessels. Radiologically, if you notice at the top, it's more black between the ribs. At the bottom, there's more white. That's signs of scarring and is what you would see with asbestosis. We mentioned that there was pleural thickening or pleural scarring. This is a Canadian chrysotile miner. That's one of his lungs. That thick white band at the edge is not a cancer. There could well have been, but that's actually just a very thick benign but very thick pleura that is constricting the lung and made it hard for this gentleman who was in his 40s when he died to breathe. The suggestion that asbestos could cause lung cancer was made in the 1930s. Some people said by the 1940s they considered asbestos a cause of lung cancer, but the first epidemiological study was published in 1955 by Dr. Dahl in Great Britain. He looked at 105 consecutive autopsies from an asbestos factory. And whereas he expected 4% to die of lung cancer, 17% died of lung cancer. So we had our epidemiological proof for what had been thought to be true. So certainly by 1942, it was called a lung carcinogen with epidemiology in 1955. This is sort of a typical lung cancer from asbestos. In cigarette smokers, the vast majority are in the upper part of the lung and the central locations. Asbestos can cause cancer there too, but they tend to move more of them, not all of them, but more of them to the lower lungs, which is where asbestosis starts, and also out to the periphery of the lungs. So sometimes it's hard to know, are you dealing with a mesothelioma at the periphery in the pleura or a lung cancer? This is a field of tobacco. I spent some time at the University of Kentucky. I would see this tobacco field pretty regularly, and I show it to you just to remind myself and to tell you that there's a special relationship between tobacco use and asbestos. If you don't work with asbestos and you don't smoke, you have a very small risk of getting lung cancer. That's a death rate per 100,000, 11 cases. We'll take that as the baseline. If you work with asbestos but don't smoke, you have a 5-fold increased risk of getting lung cancer. It's the average 1-pack-a-day smoker. If you work with asbestos, if you're a smoker but don't work with asbestos, a 1-pack-a-day average is about 10 or 11 times increase. But if you're an asbestos worker who smokes, it's not additive, 5 plus 10, it's multiplied 5 times 10, and you end up with a 50-fold increased risk of getting lung cancer. So anybody that's ever been exposed to asbestos, if they happen to be a smoker, they need to be cautioned more so than any smoker, because you should caution them all about stopping smoking. We do know that if you can get an asbestos-exposed individual to stop smoking, over time their risk of developing lung cancer will go down, but they still have the residual risk of just the asbestos in the original non-smokers. This is a typical appearance of how a mesothelioma presents. It is the most common presentation for a mesothelioma, again, is shortness of breath, but it is also associated with a lot of fluid in the lung, as you see here. At the hospital that I trained, where I was taught by Dr. Solikoff, who did a lot of the work, earlier than him, Dr. Rabin at Mount Sinai in New York reported on a new case of mesothelioma. And in 1931, he looked in the literature and he was able to find only 3 or 4 other cases that had ever been reported. It was an extraordinarily rare disease. How rare? Well, he and one of the local pathologists, Dr. Otani, got into a disagreement. Was there really such a disease as mesothelioma, or was it a variant of a fibrosarcoma, as Dr. Otani thought? So they kept looking for new cases of mesothelioma. And in the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s, in those 10 years of each decade, there was exactly 1 case of mesothelioma in a hospital with 100,000 medical admissions a year. So basically, 1 in a million people before 1950 were thought to have a mesothelioma. By the time I was a student there, and by the time I was working there in the early 70s, we could have 4 or 5 cases in the hospital at any one time. Now, we were a referral center for treatment, none of which was very good then, but it was no longer this extraordinarily rare disease. In the United States right now, we've gone from 1 in a million to about 12 in a million on average, but there are communities with 20 or more cases, depending on the background levels of exposure in those communities. In 1960, there was a report by Dr. Wagner in South Africa that talked about 33 cases of mesothelioma in just the Northwest Cape province, a very small area, but it was a mining area for asbestos. He saw 33 cases in 4 years in this very small population. So now everybody, and there had been case reports earlier, everybody believed that there was, in fact, a relationship between asbestos and mesothelioma. One of the interesting findings he documented was that while most were in the miners who had the highest exposure, 1 case was in a family member who lived with a miner, and 1 case was in a villager where the asbestos would pass through the village on its way to market, and the villager, just with environmental exposure, developed a mesothelioma. So it again told us that very low levels, very small amounts of asbestos could cause disease. I mentioned before that all fiber types could cause it. Here's the same Dr. Wagner doing a study in rats, and he showed that all the fiber types, the amphiboles and the chrysotile, could cause mesothelioma. In fact, chrysotile caused as much as any one of the amphiboles, so that there were no mesotheliomas in the control animals. So clearly, all fiber types can do it. The next logical question is, well, how much asbestos does it take? Well, in his same study, the animals were exposed for 1 day, 3 months, 6 months, and so forth. Well, even animals with 1 day of exposure, some of them developed lung cancers and some of them developed mesotheliomas. I personally know, because not all of them are in the literature, of 5 cases, 2 of which have been reported in the scientific literature, of individuals with 1 day of documented exposure to asbestos who ended up developing mesotheliomas. So it tells us that very small amounts carry a risk. Now, these were very heavy exposures. The 2 sisters worked in a shipyard for a day, so genetics seems to have played a role. They found the shipyard so dusty and dirty during World War II that they left after a day. One was in a case of somebody cutting asbestos boards in his backyard to make 2 sheds for his backyard. This was in Great Britain. That's been published. So it tells us that it doesn't take much. For lung cancer, less than a month of exposure in a factory that made asbestos products doubled the risk of lung cancer in humans. By the time you worked at this place for 2 years, you had a 7-fold increased risk of developing lung cancer. So again, if you work less than a month and can double your risk of lung cancer, you're talking about something that doesn't take much to cause cancer. And as I said, there is no known safe level. And 2 corporate medical directors for asbestos companies, one in the 1950s, one in the early 60s, both said that as far as they were concerned, and these were company doctors, that the only safe level was 0. Now, the other issue is latency. And so I know there's some concern. If somebody was exposed 50 years ago, should they still be concerned? Unfortunately, the answer is yes. The latency for asbestos-related disease, especially the cancers, is very long, many, many decades. The first cases show up generally about 10 years in some countries with extraordinarily high levels. I've heard of cases in 3 or 4 years of, let's say, mesothelioma. But as you see, the peak for disease here for lung cancer is out at about 35 or 40 years. For deaths from asbestosis, it's out at about 40. Mesothelioma is more like 45 or 50 years, and that's for heavily exposed individuals. With lesser amounts of exposure, these would have been probably insulators. For lesser amounts of exposure, it could even be out longer. And I've seen cases in 90-year-olds who had their first exposure when they were 18. So 50 years is not necessarily something you can say, well, you're safe, you're never going to get disease anymore, unfortunately. The mechanism by which asbestos causes disease is still unclear. I've looked at this in the laboratory and have dealt with many individuals. Nobody really knows how the asbestos causes the changes in the DNA to make them cancer genes, but it does occur. There are many significant occupations, not surprisingly, asbestos mining and milling, product manufacture, but construction, shipbuilding and ship repair, maintenance work, power production, railroads. But we're also going to talk about household exposure, consumer products, neighborhood or environmental contamination, waste disposal, and transportation. Here's a typical asbestos insulator, putting some asbestos cement on a pipe joint. Not surprisingly, he and his union brethren are the ones that get a lot of disease, but they're not the only ones. They also, however, did spray asbestos. The spraying of asbestos started in Great Britain in 1932. It was imported as a technique in 1935 to the United States. And by 1970, more than half of all large multi-story buildings were being fireproofed with spray-on insulation. What do we mean by that? Well, these are pictures of buildings you may be familiar with. That's the Twin Towers in New York as they were being put up. One tower more complete than the other at that point. And here's an asbestos insulator spraying asbestos onto steel beams for fireproofing. And as you see, some of it even stayed on the beam. What happened to the rest of it? This is what the laborer would have to come by and sweep up. This is what the electrician got exposed to. This is what the brick mason got exposed to. So a brick mason isn't going to be handling asbestos. That doesn't mean he doesn't get exposed. And it doesn't mean that all construction workers aren't at risk because of the use of asbestos by some of them. Here's an asbestos insulator not wearing a proper respirator as he should, dumping a bag of asbestos cement. The solution to that was to put the cement in a plastic bag instead of a paper bag, adding the water and dumping it out wet. That would cut down on the dust. But in the back right corner, you see a gentleman walking by. What is he? An electrician, a carpenter? Who knows? He gets what we call bystander exposure. No respiratory protection either. Here's a painter who is working on drywall. When we put up the 4x8 wall boards, there's a seam between them. And up until 1976, the taping and spackling compounds and the joint compounds contained asbestos. And these were sanded to make it a smooth wall so they could be painted. And painters developed mesotheliomas as well from this kind of work. This is the hold of a ship. Those bricks at the lower left, those are asbestos-containing blocks. All that gray material around the metalwork, that's all asbestos material. The highest levels ever recorded of asbestos in the air was in the hold of ships in Great Britain in shipyards with 1,000 fibers per cc. To put that in context, our current legal standard in this country is 0.1 fiber per cc. So this was 10,000 times more in a work site. And at that same shipyard that Dr. Harries studied, he showed that there were, in a 10-year period, 156 cases of disabling asbestosis, not just, having it, because some people can still work with underlying asbestosis. And only a third of them were in the so-called sprayers and laggers, the people who actually worked with asbestos. And if you looked at the 55 cases of mesothelioma during that same 10-year period, only 2 of the 55 were in the direct asbestos handling trades. You had boilermakers, electricians, welders, others who were in that same environment who may or may not have themselves worked with asbestos materials. In the United States, we have about 1 million people doing automotive repair, brakes, up until the sort of late 1980s into the 1990s, some even into the early 2000s. Brakes contained asbestos. You can still buy some asbestos brakes, though new cars come without them. There was asbestos in that dust. You'll see on his chest an air sampler. This is the kind of material. I'm not going to say that all of those fibers are asbestos. There's other materials in there, but there certainly are unchanged asbestos fibers in that brake dust. Not surprisingly, auto mechanics and people who work with friction products, brakes, clutches, and so forth, get and die from asbestos-related diseases of all kinds. So we've primarily talked about occupational exposure. Let's spend a little time on community and consumer product exposure. This you might recognize by now as how a mesothelioma presents. This was in a young man in his late 20s who presented with fluid in his lung. It was November. And the history was as such. He presented with some pleural discomfort in November of 69. They couldn't figure out a diagnosis. They finally opened his chest in March, a few months later, and they found that he had a diffuse malignant pleural mesothelioma. They found both chrysotile and amosite fibers in his lung. He died just short of his 30th birthday of his mesothelioma. Now, history-wise, he had never been employed anywhere with asbestos. He had been an accounting major in college. He'd worked as a bookkeeper, and yet here he had a mesothelioma and asbestos in his lungs. What a map of Brooklyn, which is where he was born, showed us, The two white dots under the word Williamsburg showed where he lived on Ross and Wilson Street, sorry. Um, and as you see, they're right next to the Brooklyn Naval Shipyard. So asbestos blew out of the shipyard into the neighborhood, and this is what we call neighborhood or environmental exposure. And on the south side of the Navy Yard, on the street that just abuts it, below the words Brooklyn Navy Yard, we saw another case of mesothelioma in a man who worked in a shop in that area but didn't work in the shipyard. So it blows out into neighborhoods and gives people disease. This is from a community not far from Philadelphia. It's about 25 minutes from the university at where I've worked. It's Ambler, Pennsylvania, for a time called the asbestos capital of the world. There were a number of asbestos plants. These are asbestos waste products that were literally dumped in the community, particularly in the African American part of the community, but in lots of places. And here are kids playing on those piles. Now that fortunately they're covered with a bit of grass and not so easy to get exposed. In London, the same hospital that Montague Murray worked out of, Molly Newhouse, looked at their 76 cases of mesothelioma in 55 years. Not surprisingly, many of them had industrial exposure. 9 were in relatives, and 11 were within people who lived within half a mile of the factory. Where it says no known exposure, the problem is in 1910, 1920, the medical records, nobody was asking in those records, did you have exposure to asbestos? So we didn't really know if that was the case. In Finland, they've now closed this mine. In County A, there was an asbestos mine, 6,300 x-rays, people living in that county who didn't work at the mine, 499 cases of pleural calcification, pleural thickening that had become calcified. Another county with no mine, 7,100 x-rays, not a single case of pleural calcification. So environmental exposures can be quite significant as well. This is a map of Washington, D.C., and you just see at the top side it says Bethesda, and just above Bethesda is a place called Rockville, Maryland. I worked at the NIH at Bethesda for a couple of years, so I knew Rockville. This was literally the rock that was taken out. It had veins of asbestos running through it. 1 billion cubic feet of rock was mined, and because it was easily crushed because of those veins, it was used for secondary roads. It was used for playgrounds. It was used for parking lots. Probably not so bad to be in the first vehicle, but I'm not sure the dust in the second vehicle is something I would want anybody to breathe. Many other consumer products had asbestos. This was a product sold in the 50s and 60s to fix your roof, leak-proof asbestos liquid roof coating. And when it dries, or when when work on the roof would be done, it would liberate asbestos. Here was a coat that had a label that had wool and nylon and asbestos in it. Again, not all of those fibers are asbestos fibers, but some of them certainly are. At least we had our lab tech who was willing to be part of this, wear a proper respirator to keep those fibers out when we just simply brushed her coat and got those fibers. There was something called the asbestos head. Waste products from asbestos companies were made into papier-mâché materials and sold for school children to use in arts and crafts. So there's been a lot of previous use. And then you have Christmas decorations. Have a fireproof Christmas, sprinkle asbestos on your tree. And probably the most outrageous of all, a brand of cigarettes that for a while in the 1950s had asbestos filter tip cigarettes. So imagine you could get a puff of your carcinogen with every puff of your carcinogen. We've seen cases of disease of people who smoked those cigarettes, and certainly from the manufacturing workers who made those filters for those cigarettes. Now, as a physician, I've ordered drugs for a lot of patients over the years. Injectable drugs were often filtered through asbestos filters. So you could go in the past, before they stopped the use of asbestos filters, to the pharmacy. And if you looked at the drugs at the bottom of the vials, you'd also find asbestos fibers in there that would have been injected into people. This is a picture of the hospital that I trained at behind that dust. That's Mount Sinai Hospital across the street. They were knocking down an old apartment building. Now a big new research building stands there, but when they just knocked it down, they didn't, in those days, bother to take the asbestos out. So lots of people were exposed to asbestos from these kinds of activities. And inside the hospital, the insulation was coming off some of the pipes, and so at some point they had to replace all the insulation. They threw some of it in the back of a truck. It drove up to the corner, took a left turn because that's a one-way street, Fifth Avenue in the middle of New York. That's Central Park in the distance. And the asbestos would be blowing out of the truck as it was being carted off to the landfill. And I assure you, in those days, they weren't taking it to a hazardous waste landfill. And because the truck wasn't very big and they couldn't get all of the asbestos in there, they stored it in some bins, and the storage was under the main air intake for the hospital. So even at an institution where we knew how to handle asbestos in our research laboratories, the engineering people didn't know that they needed to protect literally everybody in the complex from sucking it into the complex while it was being stored. At the University of Kentucky, where I worked, we also had an asbestos problem. Bikes would tie up. There's also an ironing board, which ironing board covers have had asbestos. It would tie up on asbestos pipe cover. But now proper techniques were used to remove it, proper suits for the workers and respirators. They would use filters to suck up dust. They would put the asbestos in bags. Water would be used, and the water would be filtered so that you weren't pumping asbestos in somebody's water supply downstream that they'd be drinking. You did air monitoring to show that you weren't causing more of a problem by removing it. You'd have to clean it up to safe levels. And then you dispose of the asbestos waste in drums that would go to a hazardous waste landfill so it wouldn't continue to harm anybody. As you heard, my work has taken me around the world. We're in a one world marketplace, Globot. We have to produce to the same high standards around the globe. What about safety and health standards, health and safety standards? That depends where in the world you work. So here's a factory in China making automotive brakes. You could have gone to the store and bought these, but here are the ladies making them and scuffing them up, and they're wearing cloth masks. It's certainly not going to keep the asbestos out. Here's the textile part of the plant, asbestos lying around, and again, cloth masks. Here was an interesting little vignette. The lady in the picture, it was Bring Your Daughter to Work Day. I'm being facetious. She was doing a day of overtime on a weekend day when I was at the factory. The gentleman in the far background was the factory physician. He'd worked his whole life at this factory and knew about all the asbestos-related disease. The gentleman in the foreground was the dean of the School of Public Health in Beijing at the time. And the lady was going to bring her daughter because she had nobody to watch her. And we sort of cautioned them that it's not a good place for children to be around asbestos in factory settings. In the world of public health, legal actions can bring about change. Why do we not see more regulations? Because, again, companies have been able to keep them away, but you take these companies to court and they somehow decide that maybe exposing people and continuing to put asbestos in our products is not a good idea. So there's issues of workers' compensation, third-party lawsuits, and the question is, what did the companies know and when did they know it? There was significant prevention literature by 1930. Companies could be put on notice by writings from that era that they needed to not only use either substitutes or put in good ventilation or use respirators on their workers, but as the writers also made note of, you should educate workers about, as they wrote, the sane appreciation of the risk of working with asbestos. And this goes back to the 1930s. Asbestos litigation brought us the Boral case in the 1960s, the first successfully litigated case. A lot of companies have gone into bankruptcy over asbestos. There's still not congressional legislation banning asbestos. It's still a fight going on in the courts, literally as I'm speaking with you today. And to finish up, some of you will recognize this as the World Trade Center. I showed you pictures of it going up. This is the World Trade Center coming down. This was the pile at the time with asbestos on beams. This was the dust in lower Manhattan. And many of us literally at the time predicted that people in that part of New York and those that had been at the pile would develop asbestos disease. And unfortunately, here we are, 25 years later, and our predictions are coming true. What did we do with all those steel beams? Well, one of them, is standing in New York. A couple of them went into military ships. Most of them were shipped overseas back to China and India for reprocessing of the steel. Unfortunately, we shipped them over with the asbestos still on there, let the Indian workers or the Chinese workers take the asbestos off. We didn't do them the favor of reducing their risk by removing it before we sent the steel over there. So the legacies of the past tells us that we're still going to see much disease and death into the future. Even if we banned it today, for 50 years, we're still going to see asbestos disease in this country. Industrial use, not nearly as much as before, but it's still out there. Engineering controls are not always well developed. They talk about regulatory feasibility instead of just outright banning it. We have continuing legal issues with uncharted, complex issues going to court. And we still have 25 million tons of asbestos in place here in the United States. And so, like all dust diseases, like black lung from coal dust or silicosis, asbestos-related diseases are still best treated by prevention. If you don't get exposure, you can't get disease. So I thank you for your attention, and I think, Nickie, we have a little bit of time for some questions.
Yes, sir. Well, I would like to thank Dr. Frank for his time and his very informative presentation. What is the big deal on asbestos? It was very informative, and I do appreciate you including and answering within the presentation a lot of the questions that were presented during registration. A couple of more. There's one that, are there any types of home testing for the public to assess their exposure, such as tests for radon that have been developed? Is
Yes,
there anything?
there are commercial labs where you can either have them come in or you can take a sample of material that you're concerned about. While electron microscopic testing can be expensive, polarizing light, which will just tell you, is there asbestos or not? It gives you a rough estimate of how much is there. Yes, you can send those off to labs and they can tell you that there's asbestos in the material in your home.
Thank you. Another question. Are autoimmune diseases, specifically rheumatoid arthritis, linked to asbestos exposure?
We certainly know that other dust diseases can cause immunological diseases. Silica is classic for that. Interestingly, some of the earliest work Dr. Selikoff did showed in the 1950s that there was rheumatoid factor increased in individuals with exposure to asbestos. That's never really been linked to the true development of rheumatoid arthritis, but we do know that the rheumatoid factor increased following exposure to asbestos, but I'm not sure that there's a scientifically documented absolute risk that there's autoimmune disease.
Can you comment on articles that document that asbestos exposure can contribute to the onset of prostate cancer?
Yes, this comes up. I do a lot of medical legal work for injured individuals, and prostate cancer occasionally gets asked of me. There really is no good evidence, not enough for me as someone who sees a lot of asbestos disease and reads the literature to say that prostate cancer truly is related to asbestos. There's a couple of articles that you can find where people have suggested this, but really good studies have not truly documented this.
This one you pretty much answered within your presentation, but another one person inquired, they worked in administrative roles throughout the plant. Should they be concerned with exposure?
And the simple answer is yes. If walking through the plant, other workers were handling asbestos-containing materials. We know in some asbestos factories that the secretarial staff, either from workers coming in with asbestos on their person and clothing, or if they had to go out to the plant to see people, they could end up with disease. Now, obviously, their exposures are much lower than the workers that are there every day, but they are not entirely risk-free.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we are out of time for additional questions and answers. So I will not be able to get any more today, but you can email and send your questions in. And hopefully we will be able to get those answered for you in a timely manner. I would like to give a special thank you to those, well, Dr. Frank, again, thank you very much for your presentation. I'd like to give a special thank you to those who helped put on this webinar together. Loki Harmon and Greg Lewis from the Department of Energy, along with all the former worker programs and their coordinators. I would like to thank CPWR, the Center for Construction Research and Training, for allowing us to use their Zoom platform for this webinar, with a special thank you to their program director, Miles Fisher, and his staff. Please note, when you leave the webinar, the web browser will automatically direct you to a short survey that'll take a few minutes. We will really appreciate your feedback. On behalf of the DOE Former Worker Program, thank you very much for attending today and for your time and attention. Please feel free to reach out to us with any questions. Thank you again.